Welcome, Excellencies, delegates, students, colleagues, friends. My name is Dmitry Grozbinsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Graduate Institute of Geneva's Geneva Trade Platform, and it is my privilege and honor to welcome you here and to introduce our speaker and our discussant for the day. Our speaker is Executive Vice President of the European Commission and Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, and our discussant is the Graduate Institute's own Professor Richard Baldwin, who has actually recently published a book on revitalizing multilateralism, which feels incredibly apropos for this moment. The Geneva Trade Platform's mission is in large part to facilitate inclusive, important dialogue in support of trade policy, and I think this meeting certainly falls under that category. It's just 75 days until the opening plenary of the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. Negotiations in Geneva, I know, are frenzied, and many of the people in this room bear the strains of that. But only political leadership and vision in the final stretch can get any of these negotiations across the line. The Executive Vice President joins us today to share EU priorities for the World Trade Organization ahead of the Ministerial Conference. I think it's fair to say the European Union has a special connection to the WTO. When a member of the European Commission raises a flag, they are speaking for 27 member states. But I think more fundamentally than that, the foundational principle of the WTO, the notion that peace and prosperity and shared progress are advanced when governments bind themselves to rules, when they create structured processes to discuss the implementation and advancement of those rules, and when disputes inevitably arise, adjudicate those disputes through a system of law rather than power politics. I think all of those foundational elements lie at the heart of the European project too, and I trust I'm getting that right. I look forward to hearing the EVP's vision, and I trust you are as well. Before I get out of the way and let him present that vision, just some very rapid housekeeping. Today's session will have three parts. Initially, the EVP will present his remarks. He will then join Professor Baldwin for a discussion of that vision before taking questions both from those in the room and those joining us on Zoom. When Professor Baldwin does call for questions from the room, I would ask that you raise your hand so that we can bring a microphone to you. And those of you joining on Zoom can ask questions at any time via the Q&A function, which, if you are new to Zoom, is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those asking questions in the room will be heard, but will not be seen, so feel free to ask even if you are having a bad hair day. And with that warning out of the way, I have but two duties remaining. The first is to thank the teams here at the EU Permanent Mission for their support and for hosting us, and to thank my own team at the Geneva Trade Platform that has worked very, very long hours to try to pull this off. And second, it's my duty to yield the floor to the Executive Vice President. Executive Vice President, if you could, the room is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank organizers for this event, Graduate Institute of Geneva and the EU delegation to the World Trade Organization for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here in Geneva, one of the global capitals of multilateral cooperation and of brilliant thinkers. One of the city's greatest minds, philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, once famously said that to live is not to breathe, but to act. Ladies and gentlemen, it's high time for action. In about 2 months, ministers will gather here for the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. They will meet at a time when the case for global trade rules, sometimes even free trade at large, is alarmingly contested. So today I would like to talk about two things. First, why we need the reform of the World Trade Organization, and then how to get there. On the first point, I know I'm preaching to the converted here. For most of us, the case for openness and fairness is a no-brainer. The World Trade Organization is at the heart of the multilateral trading system that contributed to stable economic growth for over a quarter of a century, and GATT even for much longer than that. This in turn has helped to lift millions of people out of poverty. Research suggests that on average, after joining GATT or World Trade Organization, trade between members are almost tripled. And that matters because global trade helps to create jobs. Let me give you a few numbers from Europe. 38 million jobs in the EU depend on exports. This means that nearly 1 in 5 jobs is linked to the EU exports to non-EU countries. But there is much more to this story than just those figures. Global trade rules have created predictability and stability. In the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, a stable trading environment is more important than ever to stimulate economic recovery. So why am I emphasizing these basic facts? Well, in some ways, the rules of global trade are like oxygen. They have been with us for so long that we start forgetting about them. We take them for granted. But if they were to disappear, we would immediately remember how vital they are for us to function. We have to acknowledge that benign neglect is not a solution. It sucks the oxygen out of the room. A fragmented trading system based on power relations will harm everybody and benefit no one. It will also hit the interest of those developing countries that are less integrated in the global trade. That will be particularly tragic at the time when we are witnessing a historic effort by African leaders to integrate their continent. For me, in the end, it all comes down to the question about what we want. Do we want a stable and predictable trading environment or uncertainty? Do we want a WTO that is an independent arbitrator on trade disputes, or do we want unmanaged clashes with negative repercussions for everybody? Do we want a forum to develop a new trade rules, or we see where the power conflicts will take us? For me, it's clear. The world without a functioning WTO is a worrisome place. But business as usual is not an option either. The face of trade has changed considerably since the foundation of the WTO. Meanwhile, the rules that govern the organization have not. In its current form and state, the WTO is caught between a rock and a hard place. Its negotiating function is paralyzed. Its dispute settlement system is frozen. And its membership is deeply divided as to the direction in which the organization should go. There is an absence of a common purpose. Some even argue for a WTO 2.0 of like-minded countries as the only way forward. It is beyond all question that WTO is an urgent need of reform. This takes me to the second point. How do we reform? The EU set out its vision for a reformed WTO with concrete proposals in its renewed trade policy strategy in February. Without going too much into detail, let me highlight a few overarching ideas which I believe will be key as we look beyond the immediate outcomes of MC12. Broadly speaking, we believe deep reform should work along the 3 tracks. First, we need to restore the centrality of the WTO in international trade negotiations. Trade rules need to finally catch up with the realities of the 21st century. For example, this century is digital and trade rules need to reflect this. Of course, the list does not stop there. We need to address issues such as investment facilitation and update rules on subsidies, including both industrial and agricultural subsidies. On agriculture, people have been expecting new negotiations since the end of Uruguay round in 1994. We need realistic but meaningful outcomes here. Efforts on these, as well as transparency, should be complemented by a meaningful negotiation agenda on domestic support. We also need to conclude negotiations on fisheries subsidies as a matter of priority. There are, of course, differences between the various constituencies, and we need to bridge them. But we believe that the text we have is a good basis, and it would require a little bit of courage from each of us to get into the landing zones. A pragmatic result of these issues would be a boost for the WTO. But let's be pragmatic. Let's admit that the perfect can be the enemy of the good, and focus on delivering outcomes in the real world rather than reaching for the stars. Let's combine areas where multilateral agreements are possible with those where we can only achieve progress through open and inclusive multilateral agreements. Second, we need to design a trade policy to meet new global challenges. The pandemic is yet another reminder that trade does not exist in a vacuum and that cooperation is key. The EU believes that trade can and must play its role in addressing the big tests of our time, from health issues to climate change to digital. On the pandemic response, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Director General Dr. Gozi for her unfailing effort to promote equity in vaccine production and distribution. By connecting the relevant dots and actors, she has clearly moved the needle on the international debate. The EU has long been a global leader in medical goods. We will continue to step up production to benefit others as quickly as possible. We have already exported more than 700 million vaccines to 130 countries, and we plan to do more. We have already committed to donating 250 million doses. And we will add a new donation of another 200 million doses to low-income countries until the middle of the next year. And we are also supporting the development of production capacity outside the EU. Just recently, we committed to mobilize 1 billion euros to help the establishment of mRNA production capacities in Africa. This initiative aims at tackling all the barriers to production, from infrastructure and production capacity to training and skills, supply chains management, and a strengthened regulatory framework. This is what is needed to ramp up production. Globally, the production of vaccines has increased at unprecedented rates. It is estimated that more than 11 billion doses of COVID vaccines will be produced in 2021. And this compares to the total annual global output of all vaccines before COVID of just 5 billion. However, now that manufacturing capacity is coming on board, we need equitable access to vaccines so that they can get in the arms of the global population. Here is where the WTO, through the Trade and Health Initiative, can play a role by facilitating trade and avoiding any restrictions or barriers to trade. This is why the EU is working towards a ministerial declaration on trade and health at MC12. On climate change, we need to put our heads together on this and other environmental challenges. Here, we should explore how the trading system can help us reach climate neutrality, for example, via the liberalization of environmental goods and services. The 21st century is the digital century. E-commerce is rapidly growing force in global trade. Accordingly, e-commerce negotiations at the WTO can and should shape modern rules to facilitate trade in this burgeoning sector. We should use the MC12 as a launchpad to give it further impetus. In addition, we need to help the WTO establish a dialogue with other international bodies. In the area of labor, for example, the WTO should work to reinforce its cooperation with the International Labour Organization on how trade policies should promote decent work. This is particularly important to ensure that trade is free from forced labor. And those are just some avenues which are worth exploring. At the same time, we need to be honest with ourselves that the WTO is not the tool to solve all the problems of the world. But we can make small yet important steps to deliver for the global community in areas that matter. Third work strand, we need to work together to fix the dispute settlement system. In a world of growing geopolitical tensions, a well-functioning dispute settlement system is critical to avoid the escalation of trade conflicts. Sober, independent adjudication will help depolitize trade. We acknowledge the concerns about the functioning of the appellate body, and we are open to consider major reforms, provided that they make the dispute settlement system more effective and legitimate. It cannot be just a question of returning to 1995, and even less so going back to the days of the GATT when disputes were regularly blocked and conflicts escalated. At MC12, we need to start a serious process of negotiations on dispute settlement reforms with a view to have a fully functioning system no later than MC13. We cannot achieve any of this on our own. We need to work with all WTO members. In this process, we will have to address painful questions, but this is the only way for us to set the WTO on track and help it to stay relevant in the 21st century. With effectively 8 weeks to go until MC12, this is a critical moment. We need all hands on deck. We have to stop speaking past each other and focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. The case for the WTO is irrefutable. It has served our economies well for decades. Let us act and get things moving. Thank you.
Well, that was a very clear, strong call for a rules-based trading system and eloquent defense of the profit that the world, humanity has got from that. I think it's worth saying that the fact that the trade minister of the EU is also the executive vice president of the Commission sends a powerful message as to how important the world of trade, the world trading system, and the WTO is to the EU, which is, as we all know here, the largest trader in the world. Not all the countries in the world are putting such a strong emphasis on trade, and that, of course, is one of the problems. Now, what I'd like to do with just my first question, and I think we should go to the audience quite quickly, but I want to kind of push back and challenge you on your, maybe rosy is too strong a word, or optimistic view. The WTO has become a place to say no, to delay things, to prevent things from happening. So how do we change that? How do we get beyond that?
Indeed, that's exactly the problem, and that's exactly what needs to change. If WTO is to stay relevant, it's clear we haven't had any multilateral outcomes for a long time. I was mentioning the dispute system is paralyzed and so on and so forth. But the question is that we cannot continue this way, and we need really to use MC12 to get things moving and to show that WTO can stay relevant in the 21st century. And I think we now have a good moment for this. We have a new dynamic Director General, Dr. Gozia Fonja-Igala. We have a new administration in the United States, which is much more committed to multilateralism, to international cooperation than the previous Trump administration was. So we need to use this moment and to move things forward. Well, of course, we are now also assessing the situation. There are 2.5 months to go until the MC12, where we stand, what needs to be done, and also from the EU side, we are ready to work very actively and to contribute to those various work streams and contributes that we arrive at the meaningful outcomes, and that's exactly what we are going to do now in the run-up to MC12, and then hopefully we'll be building on the decisions we should be taking in MC12.
Thank you very much. So let me bounce an idea off you and see, this is a little bit what Dr. Ngozi is doing to sort of change the mood music at the WTO. Instead of just a place where you negotiate tariffs and quotas, it's about livelihoods. The WTO is really about a place where we save lives with vaccines, with adapting, mitigation of climate change, transfer of technology, bringing more people out of poverty. In some sense, Dr. Ngozi is exactly the right person to change the perception of the WTO from being part of many problems, something we have to deal with painfully, to being an essential problem, part of the solution to the 21st century challenges facing humanity. Is there, and I can see that in the strategy that the EU announced, that this is about sustainability, it's about the big challenges, and trade plays a role in that. How do you see, MC12 of course is the first hurdle, but how do you see that idea that the perception of the WTO could be changed, where it attracts head of state attention because it really is an essential part of solving these problems on climate, on inequality, on health, on whatever? What would be your reaction to that pie in the sky idea?
Well, I would say it's not so much pie in the sky anymore, as there are already concrete initiatives responding exactly to those challenges. Also in my speech I mentioned Trade and Health Initiative, which is of course directly linked to the pandemic's response and how to ensure that trade contributes to the way we deal with the pandemics, accessibility of vaccines, that there are no blockages, restrictions, that really vaccines can go where they are most needed. On trade and environment, there's a number of concrete steps which can be done to make sure that trade policy contributes to the fight against climate change and addressing other environmental challenges. I was mentioning trade and labor, on decent labor standards, where we think also WTO can step up its work. Indeed, WTO also needs to respond to those new challenges and evolve over the time. And indeed, it's not only about tariffs, it's now about much broader issues. We need to remember, of course, that there are limits. As I said, WTO is not the organization which can solve all the world problems. So we'll need to work in different formats and different settings, but WTO can make its meaningful contribution.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to ask one fairly specific question, then throw it up. So for those of you in the audience want to ask a question, please prepare it. So you talked about digital, and this is a digital century. We need rules for these things, and in fact, we're getting rules for these things. It's just not coordinated, and that's really what the WTO could do. But when WTO membership looks at digital rules, they're looking at it from very different perspectives than, say, here in Geneva, where electricity goes out and 90 seconds later it's all back up and we're back online, just like that. It's not the way it works in a lot of countries. And so there's an issue of digital inclusion. I think people wondering that perhaps if they lock themselves into rules now, countries will be locked out from the digital, not be able to protect their digital industries. How would you address inclusion with this digital rulemaking that is going forward? How would you address that?
But that's exactly the point which we are making also in e-commerce negotiations, but also when we are putting forward proposals within the European Union in the context of what we call the EU Digital Decade, is among other things exactly to ensure inclusion, to ensure fair competition. We see the situations where dominant market players are in a sense dictating their conditions by this distorting competition, creating problems for smaller companies. We are coming with concrete proposals how to rectify it, how to, in a sense, level the playing field. Another important area, this kind of brings me a bit broader than WTO, of course, is digital skills. In digital century, you need digital skills, and there we see a shortage, I would say, across the board, including the European Union. So definitely, we need to address this digital skills and equipping people, in a sense, with right skills, so they can have job opportunities in this rapidly changing labor market due to digitalization. So where the role of the WTO on all this can be is once again setting global rules, ensuring fair competition, addressing potential distortions, countering certain protectionist, counterproductive tendencies. For example, in e-commerce negotiations, we are emphasizing from the EU that there should be no unjustified obstacles being created for data flows, because that's a key for digital economy to function internationally. So there are many things to do on e-commerce negotiations. I would say on a number of areas we are making good progress. In some, further work obviously will be needed, because some of the most difficult questions, including the data flows, obviously will require more work.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll go to the in-person audience for a question. Who wants to be the brave first? Oh, actually, I never asked for the first question. I'm asking for the second question now. So you're not the icebreaker. No takers? I'm sure there's a bunch online, so. Please, could we get the microphone over here? No, it's here, up here, Dimitri.
Thank you very much. My name is Christine Cadus. I am Professor of European Union Law at the University of Geneva. Thank you very much for your speech on trade, Mr. Commissioner, Vice President. I'm interested in knowing about the view of the European Union in the trade policy, because, of course, trade policy has tensions with sustainable development, and all the negotiations that are taking place in the WTO, and many countries that are maybe not at the same level of development as European countries would need rather to liberalize trade and to get more of this trade aspect than the development and the sustainable development, protection of environment, labor standards, etc. So how the European Union is envisaging to promote and convince these states to go with the European Union in trying to combine trade and sustainable development, including environmental policy, climate change, and labor standards.
Thank you for that question. Please.
On trade and sustainable development, it was also important element of our new trade policy strategy. In a sense, there were three keywords: open, sustainable, and assertive. So on sustainability, so what we are doing now with new trade policy strategy, well, first of all, we are ready when we are negotiating free trade agreements with our international partners. We are always negotiating also ambitious trade and sustainable development chapter. And now we have launched a review of how we do those trade and sustainable development chapters, seeing also in a sense how to make the conditions of these chapters, how to improve implementation and enforcement. So that's one important element. Exactly the issues you mentioned, like environment, labor rights, human rights more broadly, are the ones which are covered by those trade and sustainable development chapters. Then, going forward, we have agreed that the European Commission will be proposing for each new trade negotiations to make adherence to Paris Agreement as an essential element, so that countries with whom we are making trade deals are adhering to Paris Agreement. In case of G20 countries, so the largest emitters, will seek commitments on carbon neutrality when negotiating trade agreements with G20 countries. We will, in a sense, actively explore use already existing trade and sustainable development chapters to actively have a dialogue with certain countries on this. So there are many new initiatives which we will do through this bilateral track. Then there are a couple of things which we are doing also unilaterally. To give some examples, we will soon propose legislation, although now we have legislation in place that prohibits placement in the market of illegally lodged timber. We will now broaden this approach in a sense, not deriving goods and services from recently deforested areas, which we know is an issue in the context of certain, especially agricultural commodities. We'll propose by the end of the year due diligence legislation on, in a sense, obliging companies to ensure that they are not sourcing goods and services which come with serious environmental or human rights violations. So there's things we are going to do unilaterally, and also, as we mentioned, initiatives like on trade and climate, which we want to pursue and advance multilaterally in the context of WTO. So there are various elements, but clearly our intention is to strengthen the sustainability dimension of our trade policy.
Thank you. There was okay, take another question here, please. Just right in the front. And if there's a student in the audience who wants to ask you questions, we get some young people asking too. So I know there's some graduate students.
I'm a student. I'm a permanent representative of Kazakhstan to the WTO and UN, and I represent the country which is chairing the ministerial conference. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not able to host in our capital the ministerial conference. Also, we very much wish so. So, thank you, Vice President Dombrovskis, for your presentation, highlighting the priorities for the European Union and European Commission from MC12. And you have highlighted a number of issues where we are now discussing plurilaterally, and some of the issues we're discussing multilaterally with different degrees of readiness for conclusion by the ministerial meeting. And as we know well, the negotiations are not taking place smoothly. There are a lot of divergent views. So with all this, I would like just to ask a concrete question. If there are two major, biggest priority multilateral outcomes at MC12, what would be said from EU's perspective? Thank you.
Well, the problem is that it's difficult now to single out two, because I mentioned some 4 on 5. Well, one which I definitely would single out is a question of the WTO reform, because that's relevant for all other work streams, how they will advance. So what we want to achieve in a sense is setting up a WTO working group on WTO reform with an aim to reach a substantial outcome by MC13. So this is, I think, one very important deliverable. Then, in terms of practical deliverables, we must see, I think it's within reach. It will require lots of work and effort, but within reach to conclude fisheries negotiations. Also, services domestic regulation. I think those are the ones which we can actually conclude, and we must create a work program on agricultural negotiations. I already outlined some elements. And looking forward, I mentioned the trade and health, trade and climate initiatives. So those are the important ones. As you see, all of them are important for different reasons, so it's difficult now to single two out of them. In a sense, we'll be working on all those work streams and to see how far realistically we can get in each of them.
Thank you very much. There was another question back there, please. Dimitri. There's a student somewhere here, somewhere? Okay, and then you're next after that. And then I should go to somebody online.
Yes, hello, Executive Vice President. My name is Alice Tipping. I work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're a non-profit think tank based in Geneva. And we follow trade issues very closely, including fisheries subsidies, which I'm very pleased to have heard you mention. When you talked about it the first time, you talked about the need for courage in finding landing zones and also the need for pragmatism. And I think most of us can imagine what pragmatism might look like. But I wondered if you could tell us a bit more, what kind of courage do you think WTO members, including the EU, need to bring to the table to close this deal, which is so important for sustainable development generally?
Okay, on fisheries negotiations. So, first of all, I think we should remember the main goals why we are negotiating this agreement. It's to deal with overfishing and overcapacity. So when we are discussing various work streams, we should not lose sight of how what we negotiate contributes, or to the contrary, does not contribute to addressing these problems. And there are still several set of issues which needs to be dealt with if we are to achieve a meaningful outcome. First is indeed the fisheries disciplines, and especially on our fish stock, and how much exemptions there can be to those fisheries disciplines, specifically on special and differentiated treatment, especially if we talk with the largest fishing nations, including, for example, China, where we think that countries like China should not be claiming special and differentiated treatment, and a number of other largest fishing nations, that there should be still some disciplines also in the case of developing countries as regards special and differentiated treatment to ensure that the problem of overfishing is actually being addressed. There is the question of fuel subsidies, especially as regards fishing in unregulated high seas, some other elements. So we need to see all those, in a sense, different sets of issues to move forward. Recently, as you know, US also proposed the specific issues addressing the problems of forced labor, and from the EU side they are supporting. So we need to see that we advance this. And clearly, as you see, all those topics show that different sets of countries would need to move somewhat outside the comfort zones if we are to bridge the differences which are still there and achieve this agreement. But I think, looking at how negotiations are going, I think it is doable if all sides are willing to work constructively and contribute to reaching this agreement.
Thank you very much. And student back here, please.
Hello, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. My name is Catherine Puga, and I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. And I have a question on environmental goods. You mentioned the importance of trade and climate. Do you see the WTO revitalizing the EGA talks or addressing environmental trade in environmental goods and services outside of plurilateral format?
When we are now discussing trade and climate initiative, indeed one of the elements of this is indeed trade in environmental goods and services. So how exactly we end up addressing it through which specific format, we are not quite there yet, and I would say it's probably also not the primary question. The question is what are the specific issues we can agree on substance, and then we see how, in a sense, we formally address them. So this is a relatively new initiative. Right now, it will be important to have a kind of a statement in ministerial conference, in conclusions outlining how we will develop this work stream and how we achieve already practical outcomes.
Very good. Yes, can we get an online question, Dimitri? Maybe if you just read it out.
Of course, we have a question from Sarah Ann Arrow, who asks, what concretely do you want to see from the United States in MC12? What issues do they need to move on to make MC12 successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, of course, I can speak from the EU perspective, and it would be, in a sense, for WTO representatives to speak on which different countries should contribute. So, if you discuss from the EU perspective, one important element, as I was mentioning, is this WTO reform. Because notably the paralysis of the appellate body is for the reason that the US has been blocking already for a number of years nominations to the appellate body. That's why it's currently not functioning. So obviously we need US on board for a meaningful WTO reform, including restoration of functioning of the appellate body. And from EU side, we are in a sense open in which exact form we move forward, whether we have like over-encompassing work on all three elements, negotiation, deliberation, monitoring, and appellate body or dispute settlement as one set of negotiation where we separate and fast-track appellate body, but that is one thing where clearly the US can play a very important role. But US as the world's largest economy has a role to play in pretty much each of those work streams. So that we discuss agriculture or fisheries or trade and health, trade and climate. We need US constructive engagement pretty much across the board. And that's what I was mentioning also. The first question was what makes us, in a sense, optimistic that this time we can achieve more meaningful outcomes. One reason that makes us optimistic is that we see that the new US administration is more engaged, more committed to multilateralism. So we hope on their active contribution, active participation, because we will need them pretty much across the board.
Thank you very much. Do you have another one?
I do. We have a question from Elisa Barancini, who asks that as the future of the appellate body remains uncertain, at least for the moment, does the European Commission plan to escalate litigation at the bilateral level through, for example, EU free trade agreement dispute settlement mechanisms?
Well, first of all, in the absence of appellate body, we have created what we call a multi-party interim arrangement. Of course, there are important players, including US, who have not joined this multi-party interim arrangement, but there is some kind of a dispute settlement system which is in place. Of course, it's not a proper multilateral system, that's why we call it interim arrangement, but it's better than nothing. And indeed, we have dispute settlement mechanisms also in our bilateral free trade agreements, and indeed we are using them. And in our new trade policy strategy, actually, we were clear that we are going to be more systemic on this. I mentioned three keywords of our strategy: open, sustainable, assertive. So this falls exactly under this assertive category of being more active to protecting our interests and rights, protecting our values, reacting when our partners are not playing by the rules. We have introduced already some time ago what we call a chief trade enforcement officer in the EU to how more systemic approach to this trade defense and enforcement. And certainly it's important that if we have agreements, that then those agreements are followed and our partners are sticking with their commitments. And of course, the EU itself is also sticking with the commitments.
Thank you very much. So another question from the room here. Please, up here next. Maybe Dimitri will get you the mic because there's online participants who can't hear otherwise.
Thank you very much. I'm the German ambassador to the WTO. My name is Bettina Waldmann, and I have maybe more questions to the practical side of the WTO negotiations. And I'm referring to your introductory statement at the beginning that multilateralism is the basis of world trade, of growth, of wealth. And being a representative from Germany, of course, I would sign every word of what you have said. But in a way, despite all of our efforts here in the daily negotiations, our goals don't seem to translate into real outcomes. So since you are our commissioner, our vice president, do you have a remedy for that? How can you help us? Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't want to overpromise, but in any case, well, that's where we are coming from. And that's why I was spending so much time describing the problems WTO is facing and that we need to address them. Whether we have remedy ourselves, I don't think we can claim so, because EU is only one of the participants in the WTO. Well, one can discuss an important one, but still it's an organization which works on the basis of consensus, so we need everyone on board at the end of the day. But we will be working very actively to make sure that MC12 produces meaningful outcomes. And with this, we hope we can create some more positive momentum from this. I know that in WTO there is even a talk of, culture of failure within the WTO, that we should be moving away from this and moving towards a culture of reaching positive results. And for this, in a sense, we will not get there in one goal, but MC12 will be important stepping stone. So right now, I think we need to focus on this, deliver meaningful outcomes, and then see how we build from there.
Good. So if I can use the role of the chair 1 second here and sort of follow up on that a little bit. In some ways, the new policy of the EU has a couple words in it that were never there before. Assertive and autonomy. And both of those words kind of elicit a connotation that wasn't very often associated with the way the European Union played in the multilateral system. And maybe in some sense, that's setting up the world for a world where there is not cooperation, where the WTO is not functioning well, that rules are not there. So let me just leave that. I'll let you react to that or not as you want, but I want to add on another question so you can answer that one. In some sense, COVID-19 has created a resonance among humanity that we haven't seen since World War II, where virtually every human on the planet is experiencing the same thing at the same time and watching it on TV. So in some sense, it would create an opportunity that we should all realize that we're in this together. And in particular, the WTO is where they turn to for some of the health things. Do you view that as an opportunity to demonstrate that this thing actually works and sort of opening the door to a stream of viewing the WTO as a place to solve the problems rather than to delay or deny them? Are you an optimist because of COVID and the outcome that's been happening in the WTO?
It's maybe a bit too early to be optimistic, but we need to work, and hopefully we arrive at good results. Talking about EU's trade policy strategy and arguments you mentioned on assertive autonomy, indeed, we must note that all in all, we are in a more conflictual geopolitical landscape. Many of the work streams and thinking was, in a sense, reflecting the realities we had also under Trump administration when several trade disputes started between EU and US and much more even between US and China. So it's some kind of reflection of this more conflictual reality. And what we are saying that as a EU, we remain committed to multilateralism, to international rules-based trading system that will act multilaterally whenever we can, but we are ready to act autonomously or unilaterally if we must. So that's the main idea behind this trade policy strategy, and that's why the first word in our trade policy strategy is open. And then there are certain sustainable. Obviously, we need to follow the times. We need to address the challenges of our time. We need to see how trade policy contributes to European Green Deal, and assertive, reflecting some more complicated geopolitical realities which we are now facing.
Thank you very much. 5 minutes left. More questions here? I thought so. I saw the woman here first. Yes, please. The nearest you.
Thank you. So my name is Karen. I'm also a student at the Graduate Institute. I have a small question on open data, since we talk about digital inclusion and bridging the gap between the digital capacity between LDCs and FCA states. So what is the EU position on open data portal from the government?
Okay, I must say I'm not an expert in digital, so I probably will not be able to deep dive in all the elements, but in terms of open data, generally in the EU we are supportive of this open data. Of course, as you know, in the EU, what is a very important element is protection of personal data. We have a general data protection regulation, which is very important. I already mentioned in context of e-commerce, we also are objecting any unjustified blocks to movement of data. So generally speaking, we remain open also to the data flows, also to the open data as regards government is concerned. But protection of especially personal data is very important. So these safeguards need to be followed when we discuss different data initiatives or data flows.
Thank you very much. So we only have 2 minutes left. So I think I'm going to flail around a little bit for about 90 seconds and then thank everybody for this great contribution. First of all, I think it's important to note you've come to Geneva. And you've come to push for a conclusion at MC12, which is not what everybody in the world is doing. And I think that sends a powerful signal of how important the EU does, in fact, think about the multilateral system. I think it's important to put down a marker that you're here saying what you did right now and pushing for a very concrete conclusion. And I'm very pleased that we could be part of putting this on. I'm very pleased to see the amazing turnout we had in the room. This is filled to capacity. Many of you can't see it. And we have hundreds of people following online because of this. So I want to thank you personally for engaging in trade and multilateral system. I personally spent my entire life in this, and my father spent his entire life in this, so it's imbued in me. But it's great to see this level of attention coming from the EU. The EU, of course, has always been supportive of the WTO, but I feel especially now. I also think what you said about assertiveness and autonomy is well worth a note, that the world has changed, and the EU is no longer playing exactly as it was before because of the new realities. So the consequences of no outcome at MC12 are perhaps different than many people thought they might be. And I think that's also important to note when we think about the kind of compromises that we have. So let me close by asking all of us to put our hands together for the Vice President, Executive Vice President. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Could I just ask the students to come here and take a picture with the Vice President?